agreed?
Agreed.
We are meeting this morning with the Irish Association of Speech and Language Therapists in relation to the standard operating procedure for the assessment of need under the Disability Act 2005, recently commenced by the HSE. Members will recall that we met with occupational therapists, the Psychological Society of Ireland and the Dedicated Children's Advocacy Warriors, DCA Warriors, and the HSE on the 27th of June. So this is a follow-up meeting. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome Ms Vicky Kirkpatrick and Ms Deirdre Kenny of the Irish Association of Speech and Language Therapists. Just in relation to your privileges and rights, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(L) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any opening statement you have made to the committee may be published on the committee's website after the meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Can I now ask Ms Vicky Kirkpatrick to make your opening statement? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Deputies, and thank you, Senator, for having us here today. The Irish Association of Speech and Language Therapists welcomes this invitation by the Oireachtas Joint House Committee for Health to address concerns in relation to the HSE standing operating procedures on the assessment of need. Our colleagues from the Psychological Society of Ireland, PSI, and the Association of Occupational Therapists, AOTI Ireland, along with the parent group DCA Warriors, addressed the committee earlier this year on June 27th. Thank you for meeting us today and giving us the opportunity to meet with you as well. ISLT is the recognized professional association of speech and language therapists in Ireland. It provides up-to-date information for the general public to aid in the understanding of speech, language, and communication needs, as well as that of feeding, eating, drinking, and swallowing disorders. Some of its aims include establishment and maintenance of professional standards and SLT practice within Ireland, evaluating, accrediting, and monitoring of speech and language therapy training courses in Irish universities, representing the profession at national and international level, supporting continuing professional development through education and research, coordinating the gathering and dissemination of relevant information to promote exchange of professional information. So as you heard, my name is Vicky Kirkpatrick. I am the chairperson of ISLT, and I am joined today by long-standing ISLT full member, Deirdre Kenny. We are delighted to have this opportunity to speak to the committee about the concerns of our members and the risks the AON SOP poses to the children and families we support. Having recently reviewed the transcript and video of our health and social care professionals' colleagues' presentations in June, ISLT would like to echo many of the concerns presented and expand on those that are specific to speech and language therapists. First and foremost, consultation. Concern was raised by our members regarding the absence of formal consultation. Whilst the 8th of September 2017 is reported as the date of the HSE consultation on the AON SOP, members have reported that notice of this meeting was poorly communicated. The short notice meant frontline clinicians who have pre-arranged appointments and frontline obligations could not attend. Furthermore, ISLT never received formal invitation to this meeting, nor has it received a copy of the AON SOP to date. Information on the AON SOP has come to ISLT's attention via our own members. The lack of consultation with SLTs is further evidenced by the inadequate definition of communication in the SOP. SLTs hold expertise in speech, language, and communication needs, and absence of a proper definition poses risks to the identification of such needs. Further consultation could be considered through partnership with the HSC's own Health and Social Care Professional Office. The HSCP office coordinates many working groups with representation from various health and social care professionals, including SLTs that represent ISLT. They work collaboratively with stakeholders to facilitate a unified voice for health and social care professionals. One of the office's key aims is the coordination of HSCP input to design, plan, and implement strategy within the HSC. Collaboration between the HSC Disability Operations and the HSCP's offices would ensure appropriate governance, terms of reference, and operational recommendations are in place. ISLT welcomes the plan for progressing disability services and recognizes the need for standardization of assessment of need. However, appropriate consultation and collaboration are vital for appropriate and effective change management, ensuring the best outcomes for the children and families we support. Secondly, resources. The need for resources, those being human resources, infrastructure, IT, and admin, to support the implementation of progressing disability services. This was widely discussed at your previous meeting. We welcomed the acknowledgement by Dr. Morgan that disability services have been under-resourced and are hopeful that the 100 posts announced in the recent budget are part of a multi-year program of investment. As previously mentioned by our colleagues of AOTI, Chapter 9 of the National Model of Care for Pediatric Healthcare Services in Ireland outlines the need for detailed workforce planning for health and social care professionals at primary, secondary, and tertiary care level. The operation of this SOP is challenged by these resources issues across both social and primary care. The key challenge to SLT staffing is the length of time it currently takes to replace vacancies. It can take 6 to 8 months from one staff member walking out the door to a replacement SLT arriving. Experienced, knowledgeable staff members who avail of promotional opportunities are often replaced with less experienced staff who need more time to upskill in relation to the clinical area and also to the new team, and as well as to the assessment of need. The new clinician may not have the trained up in the assessments required to determine the presence of a disability. The SOP, as outlined, cannot work without properly trained teams with the necessary skill mix. We know from talking to the families we work with that they want the right care for their child in the right place and at the right time. If children could access the intervention services they need in a timely fashion, there would be a reduced number requesting assessments under the Disability Act, and the need for this SOP would be greatly reduced. Margaret of DCA Warriors identified the need for Irish data in relation to the numbers of children presenting with disability. If we are to adequately meet the needs of children and families, we need to collect information on prevalence and incidence of disability and its subtypes in Ireland. And third, best practice guidelines. ISLT members are bound by the Irish Code of Professional Conduct and Ethics, 2015. As practitioners in the Republic of Ireland, SLTs must also hold registration with the Health and Social Care Regulator, CORU, under the Health and Social Care Professional Act of 2005. The AON SOP is in breach of the following sections of our code. First, act within the best interest of the service user, and a member shall also appropriately address concerns regarding policies, working conditions, actions, and actions of others which compromise the care of service users or public safety. For SLTs, as with other health and social care professionals, assessment is a dynamic and ongoing process whereby clinicians rely on their training and expertise to assist parents in setting goals to meet the child and family's needs. The preliminary team assessment, as outlined in the SOP, is in many ways a breach of this. In many instances, a complete diagnostic assessment is required to ensure appropriate differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis is essential for the clinicians to make recommendations regarding appropriate pathways of intervention. Without complete diagnostic assessment, children and families will be unable to access additional services such as home tuition, ASD special classes, or other specialist placements. Such recommendations are not possible without comprehensive diagnostic assessment. The SOP will result in delays in accessing appropriate interventions as well as accessing the most suitable educational placement, thus placing additional stress on the families. And lastly, members should take any time necessary to sensitively communicate their decisions with the service user and the family members in the context and constraints of confidentiality. The SOP is intended, quote, to ensure that children and their families access appropriate services as quickly as possible, end quote. However, in its current form, in some areas, it will place additional demands on teams that are already struggling in the provision of services. An audit of AON practices across the country would highlight areas where AONs have been of benefit and the reason for the bottlenecks. An audit would ensure all children with suspected disabilities access services in a similar manner, as well as highlight the barriers in other areas where AONs are either under or overutilized and why. The absence of an audit results in a one-size-fits-all model without considering local differences. Therefore, the limitations of the preliminary team assessment will breach, furthermore, the limitations of the preliminary team assessment will breach best practice regarding the HSC's own policy of informing families. We have outlined the main issues for SLTs in relation to the disability services, but also want to summarize some recommendations, many of which have already been identified by the HSC, including detailed workforce planning, collection of data on incidence and prevalence of disability in Ireland, develop an implementation plan for progressing disability services, utilizing existing structures, including those similar that exist within the Health and Social Care Professional Office. And lastly, consultation in relation to the proposed changes using the HSC's change model. In conclusion, ISLT recognizes the need for standardization of procedures for the assessment of need. However, the increased demand of AONs must be evaluated on an appropriate response put in place. ISLT welcomes formalizing structures for appropriate consultation with the HSC's Disability Operations Officer, as well as the Minister for Health, to ensure services developed adhere to best practice guidelines for both our clinicians and the children and families they support. Deirdre and I welcome the opportunity now to discuss and answer any questions further.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kirkpatrick. So now I'm going to call on members of the committee to make their observations. So can I call on Deputy Murphy O'Mahony?
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Kirkpatrick and Ms. Kenny, thank you both for coming in here this morning. I suppose this was my idea originally, to highlight what are obvious difficulties with the new proposed standard operating procedure. So the original meeting was my idea, and apologies if you were left out that time, and I hope that we can all move on together. It wasn't, yeah, it wasn't intentional. And I suppose, as you highlighted as well yourselves, that it's not just speech. I think people think that speech therapists or whatever just deal with speech, but I know I'm the disability spokesperson for Fianna Fáil, so I know that you do an awful lot of work with swallowing and eating, you know, I suppose all functions of the throat. So sometimes I think the general public aren't aware of that, so it's good to highlight that. So I suppose the assessments of need is it's a major problem anyway, and then I think these new proposals are making a kind of a bad situation worse. In my mind, it's like a yellow pack AON, you know, for the want of a better word. So, like, in your opinion, do you see conflicting requirements from clinicians in general, and do you believe that the preliminary team assessment is contrary to the spirit of the Act, especially I suppose with regard to the 90 minutes that's so short, and in my opinion very insulting to have that limited time for assessment. And I know you spoke about meetings that on short notice, etc., but like, was the whole thing drafted so without any consultation from me as such, or any, I suppose, concrete consultation? And the standard operating procedure proposes that only children, and I quote, who have complex and significant needs access an assessment of need. So in my opinion, complexity is very subjective. And I believe this would lead to problems, and I just want to know what you think. And also, do you believe that this will all lead to misdiagnosis and wrong diagnosis? Thank you, Chair. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you very much, Deputy O'Mahony. So, Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Ms. O'Mahony. I think I'll start with the easiest one in terms of just process. the document was created without any consultation for us. And members have reported that it has it been, as you said, a knee-jerk reaction in terms of trying to manage the large increase recently in AONs awaiting, further assessment of need. Around the preliminary team assessment suggestion, it is in that I think that came, it's hard to, having not been around the table of how this came into being, but the Act is about the determination of disability and how to go about doing that and the steps required to do that is never really ever straightforward, and often in terms of best practice requires a multidisciplinary approach to do that, and one of the solutions, I guess, around this would be the implementation of disability network teams under the Progressing Disability Services, if that was implemented. And again, because the objective is for parents to have one point of access, and so what has developed over time is that there are delays in accessing services, and what we heard on the 27th and what I think our members are experiencing is that parents are going an AON route to ensure they access services rather than under the Disability Act per se. And so it's very likely without an audit that people might be waiting in an AON queue that's never what it was designed to do, in terms of the level of complexity of their needs. So that's likely one issue around the wait list numbers. The risk of misdiagnosis is very prevalent in the SOP in its current form, and that's why, as I mentioned in my opening speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, social workers at the minute, and soon to be physiotherapists and psychologists are regulated, to protect the public, that we don't engage in any practices that might put them at risk. So it's our duty to highlight the risks that this presents in terms of even if the time changes, what is needed is autonomous practice to make sure that the clinicians have the scope to meet the emotional needs of families as well. We heard that very much, from the DCA warriors, that as speech and language therapists, and you're right, it's not just communication, it's not just feeding, eating, and drinking and swallowing. It's a therapeutic relationship that we form with people because of the nature of communication. And if you're working with little people, then that takes longer in the context of a family and developing that trust and the need to gather that information in a timely fashion. And it's not, I would even be as bold as suggesting that the issue with the wait list of AONs is not how long it's taking us on the other side to do the assessments. It's the volume of them, in terms of what is happening for clinicians in terms of, working as teams, ensuring best practice. That's to hold that work is the most important, and it's actually not that if we began to audit and quantify that, that's not the piece that's delaying the numbers at the door. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, was there anything else in terms of, did you want to add something, Deirdre?
I suppose just in terms of the preliminary team assessment, I think my understanding of where the idea came from is that where services have already reconfigured under Progressing Disability Services, they do an initial meeting with the family, something similar to the preliminary team assessment, but that's a first meeting and then they go straight into either interventions or pathways.
Right.
So where the services are set up to be able to meet their needs in terms of intervention, they have a sort of an initial meeting with the family where they look at the family's goals and what pathways to set them on.
And is that the 90-minute?
I think, well, I don't know where the time frame came
Yeah.
from, but in terms of having a kind of an initial assessment that was fairly time-bound and leading straight into interventions.
Okay.
I suppose the difference is, for most parts of the country, we haven't reconfigured. So
Yes.
these people are waiting on the assessment of need. They're not accessing intervention straight away.
Yes.
So they could, between the time of getting their assessment of need and their time accessing intervention, could be 1, 2, or even 3 or 4 years in
Yeah.
places. So then, doing a very short summary assessment at the start, you're not giving you can't give that family something to go away with for the next 4 years.
Yes.
So I think the behind it, if you had reconfigured teams, well then yes, you could meet the family and set them on an intervention pathway very quickly.
Yeah.
But I think because of the nature of the way they
goes against the whole idea of early intervention, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which is so important. Yeah. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy O'Mahony. Deputy O'Reilly.
Thanks, Chair. And just to echo the point just made there, it's not really early intervention if you have to wait years for it. It sort of fails at the first hurdle in terms of a definition. Thanks very much for coming in. And when we discussed this previously, one of the issues that were raised was the inconsistencies across the country, and my question is a fairly simple one. It's about models of best practice, and where do we have individual models of best practice? And in your opinion, where we have models of best practice, where it is working, is that really just because it's associated with resources? So you'll often hear people say, well, you know, it's working in this area, so we should model what they're doing in this area, implying really that everybody else is not working hard enough or smart enough or doing enough. But generally, when you drill down, you'll find the areas where it is working. In my experience, the areas where a new scheme might be working, or an idea or a policy might be working, it's generally because it's associated with resources. So I'd just be interested to know in relation to is that the case? Is that how you see it? Is that what would explain the geographical inconsistencies? And reference was made to the recent budgetary announcement with regard to the possibility of recruiting additional personnel. I am assuming the same difficulties with regard to recruitment and retention exist within your profession as they do within others. So you might just comment on that briefly. I know that's not specifically the question before us this morning, but you might comment on that briefly, just in terms of, in the context of a multi-annual programme. I would share your optimism, but that's really all it is, because that wasn't what was announced. What was announced was just a one-off number, and there was no hint that there was any multi-annual funding associated with it. So you might perhaps just comment on that, because I don't believe that the introduction of a new or a rearranged SOP is going to change anything unless it has resources and staff. But I'd be interested to hear your comments on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy O'Reilly. Patrick.
I will address the issue about numbers and models, and I'll ask Deirdre maybe to talk a bit about the recruitment. In terms of best practice models, from the numbers that the office, the Disability Operations Office gave us in June, you know, that were shared in this committee, when you look at the, you know, so it's not very hard science, but in terms of when you look at the numbers, those with the lower numbers are in places that have reconfigured. So one of the barriers for clinicians and on the front line is again around, you know, or even most importantly for families, is that one point of access. So, and we would echo Dr. Morgan's point that it's not actually only about the human resources, you know, in terms of those posts, it's about restructuring, and it is exactly, Deputy O'Reilly, about models of best practice. And we've had that model since
2005 it was
published, and then, you know, into 2009, and there's been no, I think the biggest challenge has been, for change of that magnitude requires front-end investment and front-end project management and lead out into, you know, it can't be done in a vacuum. It is a big restructuring piece, but it would, and the places that have happened, my suspicion is they were smaller, so they're not as, it's not as cumbersome to restructure. So all the more reason for proper project management and investment to manage the change required. And we know, we heard figures in the last meeting again about investing now because of the cost later. And again, it's again ensuring that the workforce is there. And we've seen in health and social care that workforce grow exponentially in the last 15 years. And with Irish clinicians training at top universities, the programs are recognized. ISLT has a mutual recognition with America, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia, and our graduates are recognized. Their qualifications, Irish graduates are recognized. So we have the power to produce these very highly qualified professionals. It's the structures in place, and not necessarily about a targeted number of posts, but the importance of it being structured so that it again is that one-point access for families. And that tiered model that moves into a social model of care and not an impairment model. And I think that that's the other struggle in terms of even the legislation, whereby the Disability Act from 2005 is a great advancement for people with disability in Ireland, but as legislation, it needs to continue to grow and to modernize, because it is an impairment-based kind of program in terms of what people can and can't do, and that's really hard when you're 3 years old, So, and I'll let Deirdre talk more about the resourcing issues.
I think it's a good question in terms of recruitment and retention, and I think the last time that there was a workforce planning is the Bacon report, since 2001, I think. There's been recommendations that we need to look at workforce planning for the HSCPs nationally. So we are working on very old information. In terms of I suppose the reason clinicians generally leave is because they might be looking for promotional opportunities, or they want to move around the country. So they might get their initial placement might be somewhere where they don't ultimately want to live. So again, I think possibly the urban centres anecdotally might be suffering because it's so difficult for people to afford to live in Dublin. And then I suppose the second half then is around when somebody leaves, replacing that post. So there might be a post that becomes available and there's interest in that post, but just the length of time recruitment is taking. So there is a National Recruitment Service, the HBS, and there are panels in place. So when one person walks out the door, you have to put the paperwork in locally, so it has to go through local pay bill, and that can take however long, depending on where budgets are at the local area, before it ever goes then to the national recruitment. So one person walks out the door, you have a post, you have that whole time equivalent, but it may take 6 to 8 months for somebody else to arrive into that post. So not only is that length of time where nobody is being seen in that particular setting, but then when the new person comes in, they do need to be inducted. They do, might take longer to upskill. So all that extra time on top of it, the length of time that the post has been vacant. And I think in terms of how, the speech and language therapy, it's in primary care and social care. So a child at 12 months who's not talking, the public health nurse may say, I'll refer you to a speech and language therapist in primary care. When they come to that speech and language therapist, she may recognise that it's a much more complex disorder, potentially autism spectrum disorder, and she's then looking to refer on to a disability team. So depending on waiting lists, they may have waited 12 months to see an SLT in primary care, and then another 12 months after they're assessed to see, or longer. And in terms of the work practice, I suppose speech and language therapy nationally in primary care have looked at a review of how we can deliver services better, and there is a report sitting in the department, or in the HSE, that has yet to be published, which does look at how we can improve the way we work in primary care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy O'Reilly. Senator Dolan.
Good to welcome the witnesses from the Irish Association of Speech and Language Therapists. I have a long association with the disability bill, one withdrawn, a second one, and then finally passed through the House of Oireachtas in June 2005, and that was a time of great hope and expectation that has been badly dented in a number of ways. So just to say that emotionally and otherwise, that's where I'm coming from in this discussion. The focus on starting with the kiddies and moving up along was a very practical one in the Act, and made sense. I want to just come back to some of the issues that you raised, or points that you made. Ms Kirkpatrick, you referenced Dr. Cathal Morgan saying here last June that disability services are under-resourced. and hoping that the 100 new posts in the budget, which we're all delighted with, would be part of something that would be multi-annual. So you're at least hinting at the fact that there's a lot more needed, or more needed, to actually do this work. Then there was talk about replacement and churning of staff, experienced staff moving on, less experienced staff coming in. You've just mentioned 6 to 8 months when somebody goes out the door to get them. And my question here is twofold in relation to that. One, this is a hard one to be scientific about the answer, but is the bottle half full, half empty in terms of what the need is for professionals and therapists to deal with this issue? I know there's lots of other issues as well, right? So I think it's important to get some sense of what step change you feel needs to be made. And the second one is there any factoring in teams with various allied health professionals and clinicians or whatever on, is there some kind of factoring in done of the effect, or an allowance for the effect, that somebody is going to say, I'm out of here, I'm moving on, I'm going to somewhere else? Or is everyone with their fingers crossed every day, hoping that the folk they have there are going to stay there forever? The other area I wanted to come to was, you talked about the risk to misdiagnosis being very prevalent. And I don't know what's meant by misdiagnosis. And what I mean by that is, I think so often, I don't know how often, it's about getting from symptoms to actually getting to a cause. Somebody prevents with a symptom or symptoms, and I think, Deirdre, you talked about someone is referred to you by the public health nurse, and you say, okay, there's possibly other things going on here, and I can't deal with it. So, you know, it's very easy to talk about the person has a condition. But for a lot of people, they might have symptoms, and on foot of that, they actually need interventions. But that's very different from knowing what the root cause or causes of that are. So what's the impact? How is that dealt with? And when we talk about early intervention, this idea, or the idea that if you can get in, and you have talked about, you get, it takes time to get to see the speech and language therapist, then it takes time to go and see again, and you're talking about kids who have gone through 2 or 3 pairs of shoes in the meantime, okay? So how do you think the Act and how it's being operated now deals with the greater complexity in kind of getting from symptom or symptoms to actually a diagnosis? And I suppose what I'm getting at is, you need to actually intervene before you have, often before you have the final diagnosis. Yeah? Is that an impediment, or how do you work around that? The final little cluster I have, you talked a number of times about restructuring, and I want to use the word culture or approach or attitude in the same discussion. Are there different places or elements or areas in the HSE where maybe the same resource gets worked better? Are there, clearly I started off with issues about resourcing, right? But I suppose I'm suggesting not everything it's about how you harvest and use the resources. Are there places that are better able to actually get product from those resources, and by that I mean better support the kiddies and their families? Margaret.
Thank you very much, Senator Dolan. So Ms. Kirkpatrick or Deirdre Kenny?
Yes, thank you. I will start talking maybe about the resources and how that links in maybe to where things are working. You know, I think The National Disability Authority, I think, came up with a figure of 400 therapy posts, and that was without a detailed workforce planning. So I suppose when we talk about the 100 versus 400, that's already 25%.
Therapy, that's not just
so no, the 100,
language.
no, across the board, yeah. So I suppose in terms of that's where we talk about the 100, where that's going to fit. I suppose that's where the workforce planning really needs to be done, and the audit around the country of how different services are resourced and how they are operating. We're basing on anecdotal evidence because we don't have an audit of what is working really well around the country. And I think that's something that would be really useful to be done. In terms of whether you're going into work crossing your fingers hoping nobody's going to leave today, I suppose our managers are workforce planning as much as they can within their services. So they know they have some clinicians who've been have been working with them for 5 years, are looking for promotional opportunities and are waiting on the next appropriate promotion coming. So there are people that you might be looking at saying, well, I know they'll be going when the right opportunity arises. So no matter how much you might be supporting them and they might enjoy working in an area, they're obviously looking for that next step. But in terms of you can't replace that person until they leave and you've gone through the forms. So no matter how much you're prepared for people leaving, you can't shorten that time to replace them.
Just on that, that's at a very local level. Is there somebody or some entity in the HSE going back and saying, whether it's OT, speech and language services or whatever, that in the last year X percentage moved and in the previous year, so we can anticipate? And what numbers, in your own trade, how many people are coming out of college every year in Ireland?
There's approximately 100
Just
now.
under 100.
100?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry.
So yeah, I suppose at a national level, when there will be some of that data is going in, but probably, and the Health Business Service who do the national recruitment would have working groups with the different professions. So at that level, we would be trying to problem solve the issues that are there and highlighting the difficulties we're having. So I suppose that's the national group where we are looking at recruitment, but I understand the HSE are maybe reviewing those services themselves at the moment. In terms of the impact of symptoms, and I talked about primary care and we'd say disability team level. So if we go back to that 12-month-old who's not has no words and maybe not interacting, and the speech and language therapist in primary care meets them, depending on how services are set up, that child may get some intervention at primary care level while they're waiting on another waiting list. But it's that idea of, if you have cancer, you want to be seen in a specialist cancer centre. You don't want your GP managing those symptoms. So we can manage those symptoms to a certain level to reduce, so that we're giving the child some ideas and strategies. But in terms of long-term managing that child's and family's needs, it really needs to be done in a specialist centre where they're seeing, the team are working together as opposed to one clinician offering the family some support. So whilst they might get some support and manage some of those symptoms, in terms of giving that child the service that they need, they really need the benefit of the team.
Is that specialist element of it problematic at the moment?
So it's the waiting time. So we have the specialist disability services.
But you don't have enough of them?
We don't have enough of them, yeah. I'll let Vicky maybe talk more about the Act.
Yeah, and again, even just to touch a bit on that point of not enough of them, there's also sometimes not a clear transition, so from primary to the disability because progressing hasn't happened. So there's an administrative issue as well.
Progressing disability, that program.
Yes, that process there. Yeah. And again, that comes back to Deirdre's point about the specialist teams, and that as clinicians, we play a continuous role. It's a dynamic process, and working with people around their communication and their language development, and especially around their social communication skills. In one instance in particular, for example, a lot of discussion at the last session was around autism spectrum disorder. So again, in terms of that cohort of experts, of similar to that cancer expert that Deirdre gave, again, in terms of holding the expertise, and those do exist, but the wait times for them at the minute are very long. In terms of the Disability Act, I would think that it has afforded a mechanism to capture the need in many ways that perhaps wasn't here before the Act, in terms of having, for example, the legal right to an assessment of need. My understanding however, is that ideally it's designed for complex disability in terms of the non-complex cases would be met within primary care. And again, around working, our models in terms of intervention have evolved into a social strength-based aspect. So we are always working towards people's strengths and not their impairments or their disability, but rather their ability to achieve the different things, and the finding those is so much part of what we do in terms of helping children and families meet their goals.
Do people, very quickly, are people moving from, are there issues with people getting access? So they're trying to move to the more complex side of things to get access because that's the way the Disability Act is calibrated?
I think one of the challenges, and again, without a clear audit of who the AON applications are by, it's difficult, and maybe the HSE has drilled down into those AON wait lists of the type of people and in terms of the scope and the access to service that they're looking for. However, I think there's also suspect that maybe people have accessed the assessment of need wait list as a form of accessing service rather than accessing their rights in terms of disability. Does that make sense? That it's been used as a process like that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You're happy, Senator, with those answers?
I am happy.
Deputy Durkan.
Thank you, Chairman. I welcome our guests as well. Thank them for coming along this morning. Just a couple of questions. You made reference to collecting data, collating data, and collecting data is equally important. To what extent do you feel you have been in a position to collect as much data as possible, as quickly as possible? And the collation comes afterwards, but the collection is obviously the first part of it. Also, can I ask you if you have had any competition from overseas for the skills set within the sector in this country? Most other sectors have had challenges from overseas and losses in terms of keeping, retaining staff, and I'd like to comment on that if you would. The waiting time seems to be a problem everywhere, and I just wonder, have you yourselves sought to, is it a shortage of staff? Is it a shortage entirely of a shortage of staff? Are there other issues? Is it a shortage of staff plus appropriate skills, or a combination of all? And I'd like possibly an answer to that question. I had occasion in the past to visit other countries where different treatments are available. To wit, oddly enough, back in the old days in Hungary. And they had developed, obviously, a particular set of skills and treatments that seemed to be better or had more effect, and in some cases dramatic effect, than what we had available in this country. And I'd like maybe if you could comment on that. And I'm dealing with a situation recently where a child with autism spectrum on home tuition and had been previously in a special class, when moved to home tuition, improved dramatically. And I'd like you to comment on that maybe, whether in actual fact the child's condition worsened when in the special class, would appear to be competing with all around, and obviously there not being the level of individual attention that one would expect in home tuition. So I'd like your comments on that. And the report that's on the shelves of the HSE, made reference to in relation to this general area. How long is it there? You didn't mention that, and when is it likely to be published? Because not much since doing report. You know, the world is great for doing reports. All departments are good at reports, actually, but then nothing happens afterwards. The first thing that has to happen is the report has to be published.
Thank you very much, Deputy Durkan. Mr. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Deputy Durkan. I'll start with perhaps the first two, and then we'll come back again about structuring and workforce planning. I guess in terms of data and the collation of the data, and then the drilling down of it, ISLT wouldn't have privy to its own specific data. What the recommendation is, again, around looking at having a clear understanding of where the health and social care professionals are currently situated in the HSE and in the Section 38 and 39 organizations, to be able to map that out, to ensure that we can progress in a way that disability teams are set up on best model practices. And as we mentioned, the National Model of Care for Paediatric Healthcare Services in Ireland recommends a ratio of 1.5 speech therapists per 100 children with a disability. So in terms of having recommendations, they're there. It's again about looking, as I was saying to Deputy O'Reilly earlier, around the need for project management to implement that change. And as you said, to set up systems that we can measure the effectiveness that we're having, and that we can link that back to the Irish universities and train and deliver programs that are evidence-based, but also that play to people's strengths, because I think that that's really, in terms of the UN Convention of Human Rights, that's what we need to be allowing people to live to the full based on their ability. In terms of challenges for overseas, I would suspect during the crash, a number of Irish clinicians would have emigrated, particularly to the UK, to Australia, and to New Zealand, and we would have privy of that, as they would have been writing to us around looking for letters of validation in terms of, or letters of membership in terms of belonging to their professional body. Without having the figures in front of me, I think in the last 2 to 3 years that has decreased considerably. That Irish graduates are finding employment here within Ireland. And in terms of the piece around the personal example that you gave around a little boy with autism moving from home, from a special class in a school to home tuition, I don't, there could be many reasons for that. And again, without assessment or making choices and making a long-term plan in terms of what that child is needing both at home and at school, it's difficult to say why the family have felt that that's particularly successful. Certainly within my own clinical experience, setting up structures is so important, to set up a team, that the plan in terms of an education plan and a home plan, that the steps are in place to support the child both at home and at school and in the community and at the swimming pool and going to the airport. So it's again about a broader sense. So I apologize that I can't answer specifically that particular question. And in terms again to the ways of working and the shortage of staff, I might ask Deirdre again to address that in terms of that whole concept of where our numbers are in workforce planning.
Sure. Thanks, Vicky. In terms of the staff shortages versus skill shortages, it's probably a little bit of both. So on top of the recruitment time it takes, we also would have a number of people on maternity leave, parental leave, potentially sick leaves, and in many cases they're not covered, or the time might only be covered for a very short time period. And if that is, it's also with agency staff who again wouldn't be familiar with the area or the team or the children. So it's of some benefit, but it is, in terms of that skills, they would need a lot of upskilling as well. When we do get permanent staff new to our team, we upskill them as quickly as possible, and most areas would have induction and supervision processes in place to provide that for the new staff. In some areas, the ratio of senior staff to staff grade staff across the HSCPs would mean there wouldn't be a huge number of seniors to support that. So senior staff generally would have more experience, they would have more clinical skills, whereas a staff grade could be a new graduate therapist. So we would have a supervision structure with seniors to staff grade across most of the HSCP structure. The report I was referencing is a primary care speech and language therapy review. I understand it was completed around June 2017. Again, ISLT weren't involved in it. The HSC requested speech and language therapists in their organisation to look at this. So we don't know what's in this report either. But we know that the people who are involved in writing the report are really wanting it to be published as well, so we can look at it as a profession and see how we can make changes. So that's at primary care, which will influence, obviously, children who are accessing disability services also, but it is specific to primary care.
Thank you very much.
One last one,
yes,
Chairman. If you were to identify the two most important issues affecting the manner in which you can deal with the workload, identify the extent to which the child needs a specific attention, what would you, apart from what you've already told us, what would you regard as being the most important ones?
Yeah. Two.
Concentrated on
easy access for parents. Easy access for parents. Families and children need to be put first and their voice heard in terms of what makes sense for them. We heard repeated examples again around if something is going wrong with your child, we don't really know where to go, or if it may be more than whatever in terms of the public health nurse and having that first point, and that should be the easiest, most simplest, direct way. By the time I've met a parent in my day job, they have navigated a labyrinth that is just daunting. So for me as a clinician, if I could, then I have to peel away all those walls to work with them, because it's just, again, they're just so hardened by the journey to get there. It shouldn't be that hard. And the second most, I think, is around that idea of where that Disability Act is placed on developing people's strengths and playing to their ability. So as clinicians, that a culture, somebody used the word culture earlier, that a culture is it's there, but celebrated, and it needs watering, it needs support and structure about facilitating bringing on people's strengths, and that requires a multidisciplinary approach that is based in evidence and where the family and the children are at the center. So that's hard. Only two. I could have more.
two.
Thank you very much, Deputy Durkan. Deputy Donnelly.
Thanks, Chair. You're very welcome this morning. Thank you both. Thank you both for your time. I want to get your view on the delay in access. Ms. Kirkpatrick, you've said that parents are negotiating a labyrinth to try and even get access for their children to speech and language therapists. Do you have a sense for how long it is taking, first of all, to get an assessment? So when a parent says, I think there might be something here with my little boy or girl that needs to be looked at, how long is it taking to get an assessment for the child? And following the assessment, if it is deemed that speech and language therapy is required, how long is it then taking to get that therapy?
Can we answer it in part? Actually, I'll let you start, and then
I suppose, so if we're looking purely to speech and language therapy difficulty versus a complex disability, if a child has a primary speech and language difficulty, or that's what's picked up first, and the public health nurse refers, or the parent can usually pick up the phone, ring the speech and language therapy team and put their child on the referral list, it then depends geographically. So in some areas you will be seen within 4 months for assessment. In other areas, I think the majority are aiming for 52 weeks. There are a small percentage over the 52 weeks, but in one area you're waiting 3 or 4 months, another area you're waiting a year. After that assessment, if you require therapy, again, it's geographic. So in one area you might be seen within 6 weeks for your intervention after that assessment. In another area Again, I think from the health stats, there's over, I think maybe 90% are seen within 52 weeks for your first therapy session, but then there are probably about 10% of the referrals who are waiting longer than that, and some of those up to 2 years. But that therapy, that depending again on where you are, that intervention. So I suppose the way that speech and language therapists often work with families and the types of difficulties is it's not a one-off intervention. So you don't come once, we give you the answer, and we never have to see you again. Some of these children are coming for long periods of time. But the way the system and the waiting list might be is that after you wait, we'll say in those areas where there's resources are stretched, you might wait 12 months for your assessment, 12 months for your therapy, and then you might only get 6 or 8 sessions, and then you will go back on that waiting list for another year after that. So, but it's very geographic. Some areas you'll be seen very quickly. If you live somewhere else, you'll be waiting quite a lot longer.
Can I ask you, where's doing well and where's doing poorly geographically?
I think from the last health stats, I think CHO6 would be one that's doing well.
Sorry, can you say that again?
CHO6, I think from the last health stats, would be one I know is doing well. I don't have the figures in front of me. I know CHO7 and possibly 4 would be longer, would be amongst the outliers.
We get on the stats.
The health stats, I know they're available on the HSE website, they just didn't have the most up-to-date ones when I last.
That's fine, thank you. And can I ask, these are huge variations. So you're talking potentially, let's say, 6 months to 3 years, depending on where you live. Could you give us a sense for the missed opportunity that variation is causing? So we're talking about a variation of 2.5 years between waiting 6 months and waiting potentially up to 3 years. In terms of the missed opportunity for the child of that 2.5 years, what are we talking about?
Okay. Yeah. So again, if you look at child development in that area, again, it's and if there is no, whether it's speech and language therapy or other health and social care professionals, again, in terms of that developmental process. And so from a communication perspective, in terms of, and our interaction and social interaction is all based around communication. And if that's not happening and parents aren't learning strategies to facilitate that happening, then there are considerable risks for additional learning in beginning school, and later in literacy, and or also if there are other issues being missed outside of developmental language disorder in terms of physical milestones, and in terms of looking at the whole child within the context. So again, whether it's through play, through motor skills, through language and development, they're all, the pylon, in fact, it's without having a magic wand about what will happen later, there is strong evidence to show that there will be repercussions in terms of achieving in school and those kinds of risks as well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And do you know what's causing these huge geographic variations around the country?
One of the, without digging down, again, it goes back to that idea of the data and in terms of that workforce planning. And where are the gaps in service delivery? What are in terms of having a clear idea of making projections? And earlier we mentioned the Bacon report from 2001, and there's been nothing that extensive since then. And that report made projections into 2015, and we've not, and many good things came out of that report, including for speech and language therapists, the development of 3 more programs in terms of overall capacity within Ireland to meet the demanding need, both in pediatric but also with an aging population and the implications of communication there. So in terms of the variation, some of it I think Deirdre mentioned earlier again about the workforce planning, the difficulty in retention when people are there and the time that it takes to replace people, and then to build up a team again. So in some places are continuously in flux, and I would suspect that there are more difficult places to recruit to than others.
So can I ask on this, because that's a very comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. There is a relatively simple view as well, which says, look, if kids are having to wait 2.5, 3 years in Kerry and Cork, would you for God's sake hire 10 therapists and hire them now? And when you get them, be nice to them so they don't leave. And if they need to go off on maternity care, cover the care. Like, for the love of Jesus, if we know that children are waiting 3 years, why is the HSE not simply hiring the therapists needed to bring those waiting lists down to something that these kids deserve?
Deputy Donnelly, I think you'll have to ask the HSC.
Well, you're within, you represent the therapists, and so I'm looking. I have asked the HSC. They give very convoluted answers and say, "Well, life is terribly complicated," but sometimes it's not terribly complicated. You need to hire people and be nice to them. So I'm asking you because you represent the therapists. Why is it proving so hard to hire speech and language therapists in these areas from the perspective of the therapists?
I might answer this. I think part of it is not necessarily about it's so difficult to hire. I think you can fill posts when they become available. One is the length of time it takes. And two, then, I mean, you talk about the different leaves, and those leaves aren't covered. So, you know, if you have very established staff who aren't going anywhere, then you tend to have more of the maternity leaves, the parental leaves, the sick leaves, and you stay being very nice to them by granting them those parental leaves and unpaid leave where they need it for their family, so that you do retain these very experienced staff. And the issue there for the HSE is why those aren't covered and where there's gaps in services. In terms of looking at what works well and what doesn't, I suppose as we know, there has been a review of primary care speech and language therapy services where they did look at, can we improve the way we work? You know, we know that the more clinicians you recruit, the more children are going to come to our doors. So it's almost the easier it is to access, the more people who start, recognising they have difficulties. So, we have looked at this new way. There is a proposed model in this report to look at how we can improve, change the way we're working to meet the needs of more children. The recent schools project initiative, which was looking at did create some extra posts for speech and language therapy and occupational therapy. Is just, I suppose the recruitment of that happened quite recently. And again, that's looking at a new model of, can speech and language therapists and occupational therapists work better with schools? So if we take some of the very disadvantaged areas of Dublin, for example, where a greater number of children are presenting with communication difficulties compared to their peers because maybe they haven't had the same opportunities. So this is looking at if we get involved in schools and train up teachers and parents at an educational, school-based, universal level, how can we improve their outcomes, and also how does that fit with primary care services? So we recognise that we could be doing more at a universal and targeted level, and this is one project, and it's a demonstration project that's been created to look at that, to see, can we change the way we work? So I suppose we as speech and language therapists recognise we could improve the way we work, and this report is sitting with the HSE.
Can I just go back on this again then, right? Because it seems to me that there is an urgent need to hire speech and language therapists everywhere, but particularly in certain parts of the country. My understanding that Cork Kerry, for example, is one of those areas. Is it that they're not trying to hire them? Is it that they're not willing to pay them enough money so the speech and language therapists won't apply for the jobs? Is it that they have a really bad reputation as employers and word has got out to say, for God's sake, make sure you don't go and work for the Cork Kerry CHO? Like, what is it? Are they not looking for enough? Are they not trying to hire enough people? Or is it that they are actually, that they've got 10 unfilled posts, or whatever the right number of unfilled posts is, but they've got a bad reputation, or they're not willing to spend enough money, or they're located in a part of the country that speech and language therapists don't want to work in? Why are they not just hiring enough people to serve these children?
I can answer that. Well, I can't, but I mean, I can attempt to answer that. I think it's a really good question, and sitting here today as representing the Irish Association of Speech Language Therapists, but also as a clinician in the field, that there were many promises made, so it's a bit historic now, in terms of the implementation of progressing disability services. And so from a historical perspective, and as my experience and my lens at this stage is all I can offer, is that will be resolved when we progress. So when that model and that service, in terms of the wait list and disability, for example, and the 1,700 waiting for AONs in Cork and Kerry, reluctant to move and hiring people when we don't know where they're going to B, because we're going to restructure. And now what's happened, because of the repeated delays, nothing has happened in terms of, so there's been no, they're really at a standstill in terms of how to manage this. From a professional body perspective, you know, we would continue to stand. You know, progressing disability services isn't perfect, but it is a step into the 21st century for Ireland for disability services, and it will require funding. So not just jobs, but funding and posts, how 100 speech and language therapists, but again about strategy to implement huge change for organizations between the Section 38, Section 39 and the HSC staff to work collaboratively, so to build teams and to make sure that they're properly co-located. So there is, and the project now has seemed somewhat too big to move. Do you know? So again, in terms of how do we resolve this problem is at an impasse.
Which is so frustrating, because on the face of it, it's such an easy problem to solve, which is we've got 1,700 children who need help. Go and hire the people who can help them. And by the way, we manage it in other parts of the country. Yeah, last question, Chair. Thank you for all of that. I appreciate all the detail. I want to ask about latent private sector capacity, right? I and Fianna Fáil want a public healthcare system that can deal with this. However, as with people on inpatient and outpatient lists, the waiting lists are going up and up and up and up and up. And one of the short-term measures that is working is the National Treatment Purchase Fund. Anecdotally, what I'm hearing from nurses and doctors is that a fair number of our nurses working in the public system are moving over to the private system. What I'm hearing is that the working conditions in the private system are just better. They're being treated better. The staffing ratios are better. They may not be getting more money, but that it's just a better place to work without some of the really objectionable stresses and strains that nurses are being put under in some parts of the system. Is it the case that we have enough speech and language therapists in the country to serve the population, and that we're seeing a migration of them everywhere or in some places from public health posts to operating in private practice? And if that is the case, would an extension of the NTPF, again it's a sticking plaster, but we've kids waiting 3 years, would an extension of the NTPF, do you think, be something that would, if it exists, if this additional private sector capacity exists, something that could be used to at least in the short term, bring down these waiting lists and get these children the help that they need?
Thank you, David Donnelly.
I don't have numbers, but just one thing, and I'll let Deirdre add some numbers. I think that has been looked at in terms of procurement, and you'd have to ask the HSC again. I'm not sure in terms of areas around managing those AON numbers. From a practical point of view, though, without real planning, you're just going to create a bubble elsewhere in the system. If public healthcare is you know, the Irish front step, telling someone they have a disability, you know, without, as we talked about, dynamic assessment and planning for interventions, then they're just going to sit somewhere else, and then you run the risk of privatization of interventions. In terms of the way that it might differ from the medical model is that, you know, if you're going for hip surgery or heart surgery, you're going to get better and you're not going to need. With a disability, this is likely a lifelong, it may be, and so you might be needing to dip in and dip out, and being in a system that can, from the get-go, the first time, be giving you strategies, because the structure is there within a one-point access, would be simpler. Again, in terms of a Band-Aid solution, it would be very short-sighted, I think, in terms of supporting families for an assessment. You know, we are more than our assessments in terms of what we offer families. So.
I think in relation to specific numbers, we can look at how many members we do have in private practice, that we would have some records. But I suppose anecdotally, it would be a small number, and a lot of therapists who work in private practice do both. So they might work, in the public sector and then do some private work as well. Traditionally, it's been a very low base. I know it has improved, but I think we can get those figures for you afterwards.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Could I, before I bring in Senator Burke, could I ask, how does speech and language difficulty feed into the educational system? Because obviously it leads to educational deficits. And if there is a delay in assessment and a delay in treatment, how does that then feed into the primary school structure, and what levels of support are then needed within the primary school structure to look after those children? And then the second question is, how do we compare internationally to other countries in our approach to the assessment of need and the delivery of services? Because obviously, as has been outlined this morning, the waiting times are just totally unacceptable. So how do we compare to other jurisdictions in relation to staffing numbers, to training, to recruitment and retention? Thank you.
I might refer to the educational. So I suppose there's a very strong link between communication ability and literacy skills. So for children who start school with very poor communication and pre-literacy skills, then they really struggle in the educational setting. And while schools have reorganised, I understand that they also now are kind of trying to identify children very quickly when they start in school, and have reorganised how they, I suppose, support these children in school, that they're looking at their own programmes of how they can support these children. But, I mean, if they're starting school with poor communication, speech and language skills, then yes, they do have, huge difficulty accessing the curriculum at the moment. I might pass you to Vicky in relation to the international comparisons.
I wouldn't have particular stats in terms of how people are accessing service, but in terms of speech and language therapy, of course, it would depend on the various governments and systems in place. But again, in terms of wait times, in terms of social health care, it is a problem in many places. And again, it's about how to create a solution that fits the local level. So even from my own home in Canada and Ontario, there could be different wait times along the way in terms of that pathway. And that's why within the Irish context, to have an Irish pathway that it is as straightforward as possible, and that one-point access for families. And I think that's what the system has in place to do in terms of the national access criteria. Again, a document within the HSC of ensuring between public health nurses all the way to assessment of need officers, that there is this transparent pathway for parents to navigate in terms of wait times.
In relation to rationing services or denying children services at an early stage, they don't go away, so their problems multiply. So if you don't deal with it in the preschool environment, you're going to end up dealing with it in a school environment, which will probably, first of all, the child doesn't have the same opportunities, but it must also be, the expense now transfers to the primary school system, where you have special needs assistants and various other supports for children who should have had those supports before they ever got to school in the first place. So surely there is a false economy in not providing the service at the first and earliest opportunity.
I believe it is a report in the UK where £1 spent saves £4 later, and I can get that report later, again, in terms of that knock-on effect in terms of the system and why early, and maybe not always diagnosis, but again, in terms of assessing people's strengths and needs, that structures can be put in place to support them, and where further assessments are required, onward referrals can be made.
But it just shows the disconnect between our health service and our educational service, for instance. There is a huge link there, and Professor Dolan often speaks about the social determinants of health. I mean, the health service not supplying the service means the educational service has to supply additional services. So it doesn't make any sense not to have joined up thinking. Sorry, Senator Burke.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. Sorry that I missed some of it because I was actually in the Shannon and I was actually dealing with a school that's dealing with children with autism, and it's about the availability of therapeutic services, and I had the Minister for Health in dealing with the queries I had on that matter. And one of the responses he gave to me was that there is a review being carried out at the moment, and that it's supposed to be delivering on the second quarter 2019. I'm just wondering, are you involved in looking at each area? Now, you may have dealt with this question already, so if you have, that's fine. I can go back over the review. But, you know, we've a population in each health board, or I suppose health service executive area, and I would imagine that the ratio of speech and language therapists per head of population would be, you know, the same requirement would be in each area. And I'm just wondering, has that been looked at from the point of view of, say, the southern region? Is there far less in real terms of numbers compared to other areas? And the Minister has now announced that I think there's over 100 additional speech and language therapists to be employed, about prioritising where they should go. Have you been involved in any discussions on that whole issue? The second issue is in relation to one of the big concerns I have at the moment in the HSE. You know, we've taken on an additional 12,000 people since December 2014 in the HSE. And as I say to everyone, it's greater than the entire workforce in the Irish Army, the additional people. And I'm just wondering about value for money. Say for Arbon's like you have an area where it has a higher ratio of speech and language therapists, yet there's a longer waiting list. Has there been any look at that as regards, is there a particular way that the service is being organised that is leading to the delays being caused? Because sometimes you find, and I've come across it quite a bit, where, and it was actually in relation to an area in relation to dermatology, where in fact there were a lot more specialists work in a particular area, but they were dealing with less than 50% compared to another area who had less specialists. And I suppose that's one of the issues that I think needs to be looked at as well. But the other thing is about, if we employ additional speech and language therapists, is about the backup support that they require. What level of backup support would also need to be put in place? It's like putting in a medical consultant into a hospital, but not providing any additional beds or any nurses to make sure that that person can actually do their job, or even a room where they can actually carry out a clinic. Likewise, in relation to speech and language therapists, if you take on additional people, what other backup support is required in relation to facilities, in relation to support staff? And if that has been looked at when you're dealing with the HSE or with the department, because sometimes that can be the problem. You can have someone in who's appointed, but number one, they don't have the facility to carry out to do the work that they're required to do, and number two, they mightn't have the support staff, even simple things like arranging the appointments, making sure that there's a follow-up and all of that. So I'm just wondering if that whole area has been looked at.
Thank you, Senator.
I'll start and then I'll pass you over to Vicky. I suppose firstly, the 100 posts, as far as we were aware, was across the therapies, but we'd be very grateful to take them all for speech and language therapy, and the ones that were recently announced. Again, I suppose there's two things. You can employ more speech and language therapists, and we can look at speech and language therapy waiting lists. If you're looking at disability waiting lists, it's not enough to have speech and language therapists because we're working in teams. So to make your diagnosis, you need psychologists, you need physios, you need occupational therapists. So I suppose in terms of the disability teams, more speech and language therapists alone won't solve a lot of those issues. In terms of you mentioned a review for 2019. That's the first we've heard of that, so I'm not sure what... This
was in the southern region. It was a reply I got from the Minister this morning. HSE Disability Services is currently engaged in a major reconfiguration of its existing therapies and resources for children with disabilities into multidisciplinary, geographically based teams as part of the National Programme on Progressing Disability Services for Children and Young People. And it goes on just saying that the HSE is working to have the Progressing Disability Services model in place in Cork by the second quarter of 2019, and is expected that this will facilitate access to therapies for all children with disabilities. Okay. That's the written reply I got this morning from the Minister.
Sure. So yes, the Progressing Disabilities Services, I suppose that is that they are looking to implement that, and that's we have referenced that would be the right way to go, and that we agree that progressing disabilities would be of real benefit to our clients. The other thing, in terms of the infrastructure, I suppose that if you employ speech and language therapists, accommodation is a huge issue in some parts of the country. There is nowhere to put the therapists, or there isn't enough office space. So whilst I know there's lots of new primary care centres being built, they don't always match up to where the staff need space or where the clients might be based, so that that match. And also, you rightly mentioned support staff. So for speech and language therapists to be doing appointments, the admin work that goes with that. I don't know if anybody's mapped what that kind of ratio should be of therapists to support staff, but I think it's a valid point that could be looked at. Vicky, I'll let you comment on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, is there anything else in terms of that you wanted to clarify, Senator Burke? In terms of it's interesting that the Minister has confirmed the implementation of Progressing Disability Services. One of the issues, again, around the implementation is around adequate project management in terms of moving that forward. And you talked about resources. So in some places, resources has been a huge issue. Physical resources, so sites, co-location of sites, desks, computers, assessment materials, toys, all the pieces in terms of a clinician to do their job and to do it collectively in terms of offering training to parents collectively. So it's interesting to hear that is moving forward, and hopefully there will be resources put in place to facilitate that piece of work that needs to happen. It will make some of it a little bit easier and hopefully contribute to the necessary audit to know where and what type of posts these 100 posts need to be and where they need to go. It's not necessarily around only, as we talked about earlier, about additional people, but actually about having the resources and the structures in place that the clinicians on the front line can meet the needs of the family and the children. So,
but looking at existing resources, I mean, has it ever been looked at as regards, can a better delivery rate be made with the existing resources, and then looking at where the key blips in the system are, because that seems to be what the problem is. I mean, if you take it that the HSE overall, as I said, has taken on an additional 12,000 people in less than in three years, three and a half, 4 years. It's a huge number of people, and still we're finding an area like this, then we're finding that there's a huge waiting list. So I'm just wondering, your own consultation with the HSE, have you found it just a case of, one of the problems I found in my own dealings at certain areas, not necessarily in this area, where there's meeting after meeting, but 18 months later there's no real progress, and I'm just wondering, why does that happen? Is it a case of meetings for the sake of meetings, or is it a case of meeting with a genuine commitment to try and improve the service?
As the professional body, we have not been invited to participate. In terms of shaping those changes, and
but have you looked for meetings?
And in terms of in retrospect, when documents are being produced, we have in terms of the role of the professional body to support its members on the front line, ensuring that they're working within best practice guidelines to support the families, that our advice has been sought, for example, through the Health and Social Care Professional Office, and that structure has worked well in terms of hospital settings for clinical care programs, where clinicians who represent the professional professional body contribute to documents that are then implemented. And our recommendation would be that similar sorts of relationship in terms of governance, terms of reference, in terms of disability is also created to ensure that the clinicians on the ground who are wanting to make the change, that those can actually happen. In terms of Deirdre's earlier comment around the document existing, and I might let you discuss that a little bit more again about that we weren't as a professional body consulted, but SLTs in the HSC contributed to that document, and it has yet to be circulated, and it is. We suspect that, again, it's about changing our practice. We do know that there's always ways to move forward into improving services and decreasing those wait lists and trying to work more efficiently. But working efficiently also means effective representation and being invited to contribute in a meaningful way.
Vicky referenced there the SLT review report, which has been done looking at SLT primary care services. So speech and language therapists who work in the HSE have put together this document, and the HSE currently have that report. We're waiting on it to be published. So that is a recognition that we do need to change, and look to improve how we deliver services at primary care level. The Progressing Disabilities report is the one that has outlined how we can improve things in terms of delivering these disability services. If it's going to be implemented Q2 2019, I think that will go some way to providing solutions to some of the current issues. So I think the visions are there for how we can improve the way we're working. And when you look at those pockets, maybe where things are going really well, where they have already progressed and reconfigured, we have that information, but we're just waiting on it.
In relation to disability teams, you mentioned speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, psychologists. Would they have been, those other groups, would they have been consulted in relation to improving the services and in relation to reports and any interaction with the HSE? Is it that speech and language therapists were unusual, or is it that other groups were not consulted as well?
My suspicion is that as health and social care professionals, often, outside of the doctors and nursing within a medical model, are often an afterthought. So it's a collective in terms of ensuring, and in terms of disability, we're often the first point of contact. So contributing at a higher level is ensuring the structures are there for us to contribute are paramount. Yeah, but I don't know. I don't think that speech and language therapists were.
Well, that's a huge deficit in not engaging with frontline staff, because frontline staff have huge input into how services are delivered and what are the appropriate services. Is everybody happy? Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you very much for coming in this morning and giving your time. Vicky Kirkpatrick and Deirdre Kenny, thank you very much. And we will be producing a report in relation to our meeting in June and this morning. So hopefully it will be available in the next month or so. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very
much.
If you need any other further information, please contact us. Thank you so much for the privilege today.
So, as there's no other business this morning, this meeting of the Joint Committee is now adjourned until Wednesday, the 24th of October at 9 a.m. Is that agreed? Agreed. And just to remind members, at midday we have the legislation on the Children's Hospital. That's at midday. Midday. Thank you.
Thank you very much.